All right, hello everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Ramin Jabadian and I am an advocacy associate at Dawn. And we are here in Miami, next door to the Fayana Hotel, where Saudi's Public Investment Fund, also known as the PIF, is hosting its third annual investors conference. The keynote speaker was US President Donald Trump, and the theme of this year's conference is, quote, invest with purpose. Therefore, those of us at Dawn, Human Rights Watch, ALQST, and the Arab Rights and Research Center found it necessary to hold this alternate media briefing where we will put investors and the public on alert regarding the Saudi PIF and particularly its role in orchestrating human rights abuses while serving as a tool for the kingdom to meet its political ends, which, as our speakers will discuss, is attributed with many concerns. Our speakers today are Nicole Widdersheim, who serves as the Deputy Washington Director at Human Rights Watch, and who will be speaking on the report by Human Rights Watch on the PIF and its role in whitewashing the country's human rights record. Then we have Ahmed Hakami from the Arab Rights and Research Center, who will share remarks around Saudi public perceptions on the PIF, as well as the lack of public oversight by the Saudi people when it comes to the PIF's activities. And finally, we have Sarah Lee Whitson, the executive director of Dawn, founded by the slain journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who will be speaking on Dawn's investigative research, highlighting the risks of doing business with the MBS-controlled entity and the importance of due diligence with any companies like the ones that are attending the investors conference next door. We also will have time at the end for questions for the journalists in the room as well as those online. So without further ado, we're gonna go ahead and get started with Nicole.
Thank you to everybody who's joined us today. I'm Nicole Widdersheim, the Deputy Washington Director from Human Rights Watch. This press conference is to serve as a warning to the US private sector and the investment community gathered this week in Miami Beach and right next door, who are being courted by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and their private investment fund. Our warning is this fund is directly associated with human rights abuses. It has benefited from human rights abuses and it has facilitated human rights abuses. So what is a sovereign wealth fund? What is the PIF? Sovereign wealth funds are funds accumulated by a government, often composed of government revenue, trade surpluses, reserves, and that are invested domestically and abroad. That many have been built on oil or other natural resources wealth. Sovereign wealth funds are often used to centralize and entrench political power in authoritarian regimes. And this is according to political scientists and academics who've studied them over the years. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, which I will call the PIF going forward, is one of the world's largest and most aggressive sovereign wealth funds. In 2024, the PIF was valued at more than $925 billion. That was a substantial increase from 2014, prior to the Crown Prince's takeover, when it was valued at $84 billion. So it is nearly $1 trillion. The Crown Prince has said that he plans to build the fund by 2030 to $2 trillion. So again, coming back to what Human Rights Watch has documented, last year we released 2 reports, and I'll go into depth of what those found. But we've extensively documented that the PIF has reach, influence, corruptive management, and abuses under its power. We have 3 primary concerns that we want to raise with you here today, and we particularly want to make sure that the American business and investment community knows about these concerns. Again, as I've said, the PIF has facilitated and benefited from human rights abuses. It is also the largest fund in the world, and while it does market itself as a public fund, it is basically operating as the private slush fund of the Crown Prince. It is his personalized fund. It is unclear and untransparent how it is managed, and it is having extreme and widespread reach and influence around the world. And we have also documented how it has been used to improve the Saudi, there's nothing wrong with this, improve the Saudi Arabia's reputation. But what is wrong is that it's whitewashing, its abuses, and its corruption around the world as well. With regards to the human rights abuses, in our report, the man who bought the world, this was released, and you can find it on our Human Rights Watch website and the Saudi Arabia page. We found that three primary subjects related to the human rights abuses. In 2017, the Crown Prince ordered that in his anti-corruption crackdown, the illicit seizure of many assets and companies of the Saudi private citizens, and who also were detained in this crackdown and abused. With this crackdown, about 20 companies or more were then seized into the fund. And as we've already noted, one of the fund's companies was the Sky Prime Aviation Company that was then used to transport a hit squad to Istanbul to murder the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The other point of this fund that is very important and linked to abuses is that the fund has led the massive investment of these huge mega economic projects domestically inside Saudi Arabia. One is known as the NEOM, N-E-O-M, and another one in Jeddah City. These investments have attracted and recruited immigrant workers from all over the world who paid exorbitant fees to come there and work, who work under extreme heat, exhaustion, and unsafe conditions. Many have died. They are not earning their salaries while they're working there. And then when they have died, their families are not even compensated. And we documented this extensively in our report from last November called Die Now and I Will Pay You Later. This is an extreme example of how the fund is associated with human rights abuses. So where I'd like to take us now is what we can do about it. We have primarily 6 recommendations, and we hope that the business community, particularly in the United States, will listen to these carefully. We also, as Human Rights Watch and the human rights community, are a resource to the business community to how to chart these waters carefully. So first, the first recommendation we have is to conduct a thorough and independent human rights due diligence effort prior to engaging with the business activities of the PIF and its subsidiaries. You have a resource available to you to help you do this. It's the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And again, also, we really refer you to our reports, and we can also be a resource for you to tell you what you would be getting into should you choose to invest in this fund. Secondly, this is also for the business community engaging with the PIF, adopt your own policies to identify and prevent risks of contributing to human rights harms. Third, refrain from doing business with the companies in the PIF that have been seized illegally and without any accountability in the 2017 crackdown. Fourth, please consider refraining from doing business at all until you've done your full assessment or you've asked for more information from the PIF directly. We have always asked that the PIF and the chairman and the Saudi management of it respond to our own reports. And you should do the same. Also, please refuse any explicit or implicit contractual terms, should you go into business with the PIF, that restrict the ability for you to speak out as a company or an individual, publicly or privately, on the abuses that are happening. We have already seen this type of constraint and restriction expressed from the PIF on those that do business with them. Lastly, we want to be sure that you know you can be a change agent. You, as a private investor or a company, can also publicly report that you have done your human rights due diligence. You can ask this of the PIF and its subsidiaries, which can be an agent for change and help improve this business environment. So again, please check out our reports, Human Rights Watch, on our Saudi Arabia page. We have 2 reports. Die Now, I'll Pay You Later, about the economic investments and the labor abuses and human rights abuses there, as well as the entire in-depth report that includes documentation we've received directly from the Saudi government as well, that we have obtained from the Saudi government. And that report is called "The Man Who Brought the World: Rights Abuses Linked to Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund and its chairman, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman." Now I'd like to introduce Ahmed Hakami from the Arab Rights and Research Center. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for coming to our press conference. My name is Ahmed Hakami. I am the manager of the People's Vision for Reform in Saudi Arabia projects at the Arab Rights and Research Center based in Washington, D.C. Today, the PIF, or the Public Investment Fund for Saudi Arabia, is hosting yet another event next door in Miami Beach to whitewash the crimes and the atrocities of the Saudi government and of MBSs. The Public Investment Fund, it's the sovereign wealth fund for Saudi Arabia, and it was established over 50 years ago. In its first 40 years, it mainly focused on local and domestic projects like SABIC and SABITCO. However, since MBS, or Mohammed bin Salman, the current crown prince in Saudi Arabia, arose to the power and to the scene through his father's kingdomship, he has weaponized the PIF to be a tool of repression and consolidation of the powers in his hand, and to target and go after his critics. In effect, the PIF functioned not just as a sovereign wealth fund, but also an extension to MBS's personalist rule. More to show you about how MBS is a control freak and a power grabber. The CEDA, which is the Council of Economic and Development Affairs, which is supposed to monitor and oversee the PIF, is headed also by Mohammed bin Salman, meaning the PIF and the body that should oversee it are headed by one person. Talk about checks and balances. The board members of the PIF are not selected based on merit. They're merely selected because of, or based on how close they are to MBS. Nevertheless, they still don't have any autonomy or a real power in making decisions in regard to the Public Investment Fund. And don't ask me, ask Yasser Ramayan, who's the governor of the Public Investment Fund. I bet you he's next door in the FII event. He went on a Saudi podcast telling this story about a project that the Public Investment Fund was working on. After casting the votes on some specific decision, it turns out that almost unanimously, the board members were on a side and Mohammed bin Salman was on the other side of the vote. So what does he do? He pulls a card, a dad card. He uses the king power and the royal court to make his vote the vote that should be taken. And that makes the board nominal and redundant, and honestly, it's just a picture, an image. In October 2017, the PIF was worth an estimated of $230 billion. At the same time, MBS announced the NEOM project, this futuristic city that was projected to cost $500 billion. So how would he bridge this gap? Well, the answer is simple. He would steal the money from the Saudi people and then some. The Crown Prince created and led an anti-corruption committee, as Nicole was talking about, that detained nearly 400 of high-profile Saudi businessmen, government officials, and members of the royal family. They were many of whom were reportedly tortured, and they're tortured and extorted without transparency, without any due process, and without any legal mechanism. After this Ritz-Carlton operation, as it was colloquially known, the asset of the PIF reached $700 billion, miraculously, from $230 billion to $700 billion. For all we know, this FII event next door is on one of those detainees' diet. An example of those detainees is Al-Muzaini. Mr. Al-Muzaini described the physical and mental torture that was inflicted on him by his Saudi interrogators, including beatings, whippings, forced stress positions, electrocutions, and food deprivation. Mr. Al-Muzaini continues describing the beatings with iron bars and cruel practices such as a prison guard whipping his genital every time he goes to the washroom. Again, the Public Investment Fund is not just a tool in the Saudi state hands, it's also an extension of MBS's ambition and power. So when the government kills Abdurrahim al-Huwaitli and in his own house for refusing to leave the house for the NEOM project, or when they detain his cousin and relocate the whole tribe, the Huwaita tribe, from their land they have inhabited for centuries before even Saudi Arabia became Saudi Arabia, for the NEOM project, or when the government also demolishes a third of Jeddah city, one of the most populated cities in Saudi Arabia, and kicks out more than 1 million people out of their houses in a matter of months without proper compensation. There's one culprit. The culprit is MBS and his hand of the Public Investment Fund. The Sovereign Wealth Fund is from the people. That's the people's wealth. And it should be for the people, not for whitewashing the dictator atrocities. Thank you very much. And now I introduce you Sarah Lee Whitson. She's the executive director of DAWN.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for those who made it over here in person, taking time from, sure, a very busy week and a very busy agenda to come and attend what we think is an incredibly important development with this massive powwow for the Saudi Public Investment Fund, presented as the arrangement of a nonprofit organization that is actually controlled by the Public Investment Fund, including American corporate leaders from all across the country who really are here to see how much of a slice they can get of Saudi Arabia's $1 trillion fund. The human rights record of Saudi Arabia and its public investment fund is near and dear to my heart personally, as it is to my organization, because our founder, Jamal Khashoggi, was murdered by the Saudi Crown Prince. And the Public Investment Fund played a very important role in his murder, which I'll elaborate on further in my remarks. You've heard, I think, quite a deal now about Saudi Arabia's human rights record and the role of the Public Investment Fund in whitewashing the Saudi government's abuses, the sort of massive expansion of the Saudi government's acquisitions and the Saudi Public Investment Fund's PR-driven, PR-fueled presence in the United States is not really just about whether it's good business for the Public Investment Fund, but it serves a very tangible, specific political purpose. and that is to rehabilitate the Saudi government's regime, to encourage everyone to forget about the ways that Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi Public Investment Fund has terrorized, tortured, brutalized, repressed, stolen from the Saudi people in the past several years. Hopefully the goal, of course, is to sweep it all under the rug. But companies and individuals that are doing business with the Public Investment Fund not only have a fiduciary duty to understand the risks involved of doing business with the Saudi Public Investment Fund, because they are serious risks, but they also have a human rights responsibility under the UN guiding principles to ensure that they are not themselves contributing to, or importantly benefiting from, the Saudi Arabian government's human rights abuses. And I emphasize this responsibility of businesses not only for their fiduciary duties, but their human rights responsibilities, particularly addressing, for example, Serena Williams, who is a partner and speaking at the Public Investment Fund, representing her venture capital company, who has stated that ethical business investments, ethical relationships is something that is vitally important to her venture capital fund, which I think is otherwise designed to invest in businesses representing marginalized communities and marginalized community business leaders. And we really want to draw attention to those business leaders like Ms. Williams, who have publicly committed themselves to ethical, responsible business practices, because we think it's actually very, very challenging and difficult to both have fiscally sound, risk acceptable, and ethically appropriate investments and partnerships with the Public Investment Fund at this current time. I want to emphasize that when we talk about the Public Investment Fund and the role of the Public Investment Fund and its role in human rights abuses, particularly towards Saudi Arabians, this is not just because it's an agency of the Saudi government that's fatally tainted by it being a Saudi government agency, controlled by its absolute ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, but because the Public Investment Fund itself has provided material support in torture, murder, and violent acquisitions of dozens of Saudi companies without any measure of due process. As my colleague Nicole pointed out, the Public Investment Fund loaned out its own airplanes it had stolen from a Saudi citizen, to literally physically transport the Saudi murderers, the Saudi henchmen, who flew from Riyadh on Saudi Public Investment Fund planes, I think there were two, landed in Cairo to pick up the poison used to drug Jamal Khashoggi in a brief stop at Cairo airport, proceeded to enter Istanbul, where the planes remained in the airport, did not leave, to allow these evildoers to enter the country under false pretenses, entrap Jamal in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, drug him, torture him, and then, of course, cut up his body into small pieces. Where his remains are, what the Saudi Public Investment Fund staff knew about this and their participation in this, where they hid his remains, of course, remains unknown. But the henchmen then left the airport, went back into those planes and flew back to Saudi Arabia. These planes, as I mentioned, and I think as Nicole alluded to, were in fact confiscated from a Saudi gentleman named Salim al-Muzaini, who is the son-in-law of Salah Jabri, whom Mohammed bin Salman also attempted to murder in Canada, but failed. Jabri, the Public Investment Fund, and Mohammed bin Salman have been tied up in litigation for years over this crime. including the continued arbitrary jailing of his children in Saudi Arabia when they couldn't get Salah Jabri, who was a close associate of the former Interior Minister and Deputy Crown Prince. They detained his children, and then they targeted his son-in-law, Salim al-Muzaini, imprisoning him, torturing him, and forcing him to give up his company, Sky Prime Aviation, and its fleet of planes. So these things are pretty interconnected. So al-Muzaini remains jailed, but the Public Investment Fund remains, as I said, in litigation with Salah Jabri in Canada and in the United States. Now, Al-Rumayyan, who's the governor of the Public Investment Fund, and the Public Investment Fund have tried everything they can to avoid being taken to these Canadian courts where Jabri has claimed their role in kidnapping, in expropriating his assets, i.e. stealing, in misappropriating his assets, i.e. stealing. But just yesterday, while our president was bear hugging Al-Rumayyan, Canadian court affirmed that he had been duly served process and must appear in court and could no longer dodge appearing in court to avoid the charges against him and the trial against him. As I mentioned, doing business with Saudi Arabia doesn't just come with the risks of contributing to such abuses. It also comes with the risks businesses and their executives face by virtue of operating in a dictatorship where laws and courts afford you absolutely zero protection from a Mohammed bin Salman vendetta. One should just ask the nearly 400 Saudi businessmen, the elite of the country, the wealthiest business, media, royal family leaders in the country, whom Mohammed bin Salman summarily imprisoned and forced to give up their assets, in some cases 75%, 90% of their assets. Even the country's most famous investor known around the world, Prince Walid bin Salman, was stripped of the vast majority of his wealth. Now, notwithstanding the prince's recent willingness to bury the hatchet with the man who jailed him and stripped him of nearly all of his wealth, he remains travel banned in the country, along with thousands of other business leaders and royal family members, with no court, no judge, no process. In fact, Prince Walid had an ankle monitor for a while he was trying to work his way back into the prince's good favors. I don't know if he's still wearing that ankle monitor, but I think the message is clear that for businesses operating in Saudi Arabia, you may think you're safe, but just ask the CEOs of Teneo, Boston Consulting, and McKinsey. When the Senate was holding investigative hearings into the national security risks of these incredibly expanding public investment fund investments in the United States, Teneo's CEO, Paul Curry, refused to submit to a US Senate subpoena saying that, well, Saudi Arabia has passed a new law that makes it a crime punishable by jail time to reveal details of any contract with a public investment fund. So any business, any American business doing business with the Saudi Public Investment Fund is prohibited by Saudi law at penalty of imprisonment for revealing information about their contract with the Saudi Public Investment Fund. Good luck trying to litigate a contractual dispute with the Saudi Public Investment Fund in the United States. Good luck trying to address any problems that may come up if you are subpoenaed to testify, because you will risk running afoul of Saudi law. And so the Senate hearings revealed this wide swath of Saudi acquisitions in a wide array of American industries and businesses. And it seems that the Public Investment Fund will soon own PGA Tours, given the so-called merger talks with PGA Tours and LIV Golf. And they are back in play now under President Trump. So while Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi Arabia may no longer be in the business community's doghouse where they briefly found themselves after Jamal Khashoggi's murder, business leaders do have a responsibility to ensure that they don't make things worse for the Saudi people by contributing to the abuses against them. And as Nicole mentioned, this starts with due diligence. Companies must conduct a due diligence review examining the Saudi government's and the Saudi public investment fund's human rights record and figure out the extent to which their involvement, their business, their partnership will contribute to or benefit from any of their human rights abuses. And where they find such contribution or benefit exists, they need to address them when necessary, terminate their contracts with Saudi Arabia or the Public Investment Fund, because they actually have a responsibility to prevent or mitigate these human rights impacts that are directly linked to their activities, even if they haven't contributed to those activities. Just last year, our Senate was extremely concerned about the national security risks of expanded Saudi investments and threats to national security that these investments in business, in finance, in communications, in agriculture, in oil, in minerals, in art, in music, in fashion represented. We are equally concerned about the national security risks of the public investment funds, acquisition, not just of tangible American assets, but American government officials, particularly former government officials who've received handsome payouts for services well rendered while they were in office. We now know that there are about 200 former US military officials on the Saudi government's dime, presumably with access to all of the information and knowledge that these defense leaders had when they were in office. The risk here really is not just about contributing to human rights abuses over there. The risk is about undermining the integrity of our democracy, the independence of our government, the independence of our business community to act without the fear or influence of Saudi government paymasters. I think this is a risk that we all need to take very seriously, particularly now with whatever guardrails may have been in place to limit or scrutinize Saudi government investments in the United States effectively erased. But we hope that at least the media will focus attention on this and help protect our own democracy and our own human rights as Americans. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much to our panelists. At this time, we want to go ahead and open up to Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and start with questions from our audience. So if any journalists have any questions, you're more than welcome to raise those now.
So I was checking in with the conference organizers today for comment on sort of this whole situation, and their posture is what seems like distancing themselves from the PIF. Their stance was, we've evolved, FII has evolved, and this is a nonprofit that is essentially acting independently of public investment fund, and we are not, this is not synonymous with the Saudi government like people have said. I'm wondering if you could respond to FII's sort of efforts as of today to create more distance between them and PIF.
Well, we certainly welcome the FII's efforts to distance itself from the Saudi government and from the Public Investment Fund, but it's really an incredible claim for them to be making. I think the first bit of information and point of clarification we would need this so-called nonprofit organization to inform us about is where their funding comes from, where their initial funding comes from, and the extent to which the Saudi government or the Public Investment Fund are involved in approving or reviewing anything that this so-called nonprofit organization does. For example, I don't believe that they have given all media access to the Public Investment Fund. I know that my organization's media arm, Democracy in Exile, which is a magazine, applied to have a representative present at the fund, and they just never even gave us an answer after saying that they were still looking into it. I know that there are others, I believe colleagues from Human Rights Watch, who attempted to get access to the fund, but they were rejected. So it really strains credulity, and we need to see a lot more transparency from the nonprofit organization. We'd like to see if they have any independent board of directors, and we'd like to know where all of their funding comes from.
You have other questions from the audience? Yeah, definitely.
So I'm a reporter at the Miami Herald, and we've reported pretty extensively on how the mayor, Francis Suarez, helped bring FII priority to Miami in the first place in 2023. He's spoken pretty clearly about that, and he's been a champion of the conference. Apparently today, he announced that Saudi Arabia is opening up an investment arm in Miami, something to that effect. I'm just wondering if you could provide comment on the way that, you know, somebody like a mayor of a major American city sort of championing this conference, how that factors into everything that you've spoken about today.
Ahmed?
So I think the mayor's remarks kind of prove that Saudi Arabia is still in the picture. It's not because they're hosting the FII, and instead the kickback is, well, Saudi Arabia is going to have something and have some projects to build in Miami. I think the mayor associating himself with such an organization, a PIF, or its hand, the FII, will tarnish his reputation due to the extensive reporting against of the human rights violations that Saudi Arabia and the PIF, which is just a hand in Saudi Arabia states, and Mohammed bin Salman is culprit, and they are known inside Saudi Arabia and outside of Saudi Arabia for these atrocities. So that's my message for the mayor, and for maybe the future years, to distance himself from criminals.
I think the citizens of Miami need to demand some real answers from Mayor Suarez. And I think the first question I would ask is whether he's considered registering as a foreign agent for the Saudi government. His involvement in anything to do with Saudi Arabia or the Public Investment Fund raises significant public conflict of interest problems. Starting with the fact that his law firm, Queen Emmanuel, is on the payroll of the Saudi government. And, that in and of itself, he needs to recuse himself from one or the other. He shouldn't be doing both. I think the message here is this is how it's done. This is how our government leaders are bought. This is how influence is bought. Governments like Saudi Arabia have learned how to corrupt the American political system. It's not just by giving the kind of bribes that Senator Menendez accepted from Egypt with gold bars, or our petty little mayor in New York receiving mere upgrades to business class was apparently enough to bribe him. It's the legal bribery that comes with promising cash investments, and expecting then that the mayor's interests and the city's interests will be aligned with the Saudi government's interests. And that's a very, very dangerous thing for our country. We do not have the appropriate guardrails, any guardrails built to protect our cities, our states, our nation from this kind of foreign influence, because when our laws were created, even our lobbying laws were created, they did not anticipate foreign governments coming in with $1 trillion to buy up our city officials, to buy up most senior officials of the White House, even the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States taking a $1 billion payout for a fund that had zero track record, to say nothing of Jared Kushner, and $2 billion on a fund with zero track record. The Public Investment Fund has made very clear time and again that its investments are not driven by profit motive. They are driven by political motive of influence and control. That's why they can continue to invest in LIV Golf, even though they've done nothing but lose money. And they're going to lose a hell of a lot more money when they buy PGA Tours, but it doesn't matter, right? The money is practically free in Saudi Arabia, given the prices of oil. And that's why they can give Jared Kushner $2 billion, even though it's shown no return, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not free, and Miami citizens are going to be the ones who pay the price for this.
My name is Jahad. I'm with the Arab Rights and Research Center. My question to Sarah, what kind of message does the US government and the US president want to convey by buddying up with MBS and the Romanian persons of interest in many cases inside and outside the US?
Well, I would say President Trump has been very consistent in announcing to the world, in announcing to the, to the most nefarious, malign actors in the world, that America is for sale. That they too can come and buy up our institutions. They too can buy up our sporting institutions. They too can buy up our companies, our resources, our assets, our politicians. In what is the most dramatic hollowing out of the American government, and all of the public services of the American government, which are going to be replaced by private companies to take on all of the work that they are now firing all of the public servants whose job it was to do this. And I think it's certainly not a good thing for our country, not a good thing for the American people. In fact, I think it's quite dangerous.
Do we have other questions in the audience? Otherwise, I have received some online questions. To the right over here, any questions? No. So we have this online question. I think Sarah Lee touched a little bit on this, but if anyone is able to respond. According to reports, MBS used PIF assets to facilitate various crimes, including attacks by the Tiger Squad, which he created to go after his critics. What was the role of Al Rumayyan, the government of PIF, in these crimes, and why is he and the PIF being sued in Canada?
Put you on the spot. I'm sure you guys all know as well. I mean, just to make clear, the Public Investment Fund has been an active participant in the crimes against Saudi people and the crimes against Saudi business owners. The Public Investment Fund directly confiscated and took the assets of dozens, I believe the number was about 40, Saudi businesses and hundreds of Saudi citizens who were held up in Ritz-Carlton, where you enter but you can never leave, Riyadh, and forced to turn over their assets. Where do they turn these assets over to? To the Public Investment Fund, which acts as the Crown Prince's personal kitty to exert his personal influence and control in many parts of the world, but in particular in the United States. I won't repeat all the details of the way in which the airplanes were used in that gruesome, sordid story. But, it's really a question for the Public Investment Fund, what they did with those planes, whether those planes were used to transport any of Jamal's remains back to Saudi Arabia. They would certainly be an accessory to the crime.
I want to add that Yasser Rumayyan, when he signed up to be a governor of the Public Investment Fund, he knew what he was signing up for. He knew that he will be a face for all these crimes happening in the background. He knew about all these planes. He knew about all these threats on dissidents in Canada and in the UK. So Yasser Rumayyan is as, or should be as indicted as MBS. That's back to the question about how Yasser Rumayyan fits in this picture.
Did you have anything? Okay. So I received another question for Nicole from Human Rights Watch. Why are you holding this press conference here in Miami? What do you expect businesses who are only trying to make money for their companies to do? And what does anything that the PIF does have to do with that?
Sure. As my colleagues have said, and even some of the journalists that joined us today, this conference here wasn't accessible to human rights activists or people who are very concerned about the PIF's relationship to human rights abuses. So we wanted to be present next door to offer a counterpoint of truth, fact, and investigation of what we have found over the years that have been done through this fund and with this fund's money to Saudi citizens, as well as immigrant workers and others. So that's the first point. The second point is that this matters to the American investment and business community, because we have already mentioned quite a few times that when the PIF and the Saudi government wants your assets, they'll just put you in a hotel and seize them. Now, is that something that American business actors and investment investors want to have happen later on down the pike when they're associated in investing with this fund? I would think not. I think we also want to make sure that our information is out there and for everybody, so they're fully aware and they are not investing and coming into these fancy conferences blind and unknowing. They have, as Sarah also said, a responsibility to be doing their own due diligence, both for their investors, but also their reputation and the safety of their employees. We talked a little bit about how when the Senate called McKinsey and others to talk about what the fund was doing and the things like our organizations have documented, they were told it's criminal. They cannot even talk about it, it'll be arrested. So they're not even responding to our own laws. They're threatening our own rule of law with their practices. So this is, while please we ask that the business community not be blinded by the sun of South Beach and all the other places where these fancy conferences are held, be fully wide open and have their eyes wide open to what they're walking into when they start to engage with this fund.
I have another question for Ahmed this time. In light of the new laws in Saudi Arabia to fight forced labor and minimize the kafala system, do you anticipate less violations towards migrant workers in the years to come as the country prepares to host the World Cup in Saudi Arabia? I'll also add that we've seen a number of prisoners be released in the recent weeks. What do you think this means for Saudi Arabia's human rights records, and can you just speak more about that?
So funny enough, we were talking about how the World Cup can be a good thing for Saudis for for decades. The whole Saudi Arabia is not even a century old. For decades, Saudi Arabia, and especially the last decades, have been violating human rights laws right and left, especially against its own citizens and the people inside, from migrant workers and people living that they're not Saudi. The moment they got the World Cup, everything, they started to be, they're starting releasing prisoners. They're starting to pay attention more about the workers and publicizing all that. The question, or the real question is that true? Is that real? On the last policy that they released about the forced, I think they called it forced work or forced labor. In the policy, it says they're not going to put it into effect until a year later. And the policy is talking about forcing people under duress to work without any compensation and without they're willing to do the work. And they're waiting a whole year to put that into effect. So in this year, you can do whatever you want, or I don't know. And that's actually kind of confession that we were operating all these years under the fact that we're turning a blind eye against all these violations against migrants workers. So I think it's all for media consumption. It's not real. And they have the ball is in their court to prove us wrong and to release all the prisoners of conscience. I mean, there's a lot of, yes, there are hundreds reported that they were released, but we have thousands of prisoners of conscience in Saudi Arabia. Their only crime that they did not say what he wanted him to say, or they wanted a better life. They had an opinion. So they served 10, 15, 20 years in prison for that opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. You touched a little bit on the recent release of political prisoners. Sarah, Leah, or Nicole, can you speak a little bit on what we can expect in terms of violations towards migrant workers, especially with the upcoming World Cup, but also the apparent new laws to fight forced labor?
I'll defer to Sarah Lee to talk about that case in particular. But what we have learned from extensive and continual and annual documentation and investigation is that you look back at the track record of how immigrant workers have been treated in the past. And as Ahmed saying, you don't see, is it a law, or is it a facade, or is it for public, for good media spin? The proof will be in how the government has acted in the past, in the immediate past. And our report came out on the Work Now and Die Now, and we'll pay you later. That came out last year. So we're very concerned that these trends and these practices will continue through the World Cup. We've actually started to look at that already. So I bring you back to our work on our website. But the best indicator is past practice. And we've documented terrible practices.
A couple of things. I mean, the abuses of migrant workers that have really been part of the history of Saudi Arabia and much of the rest of the Gulf, in fairness, has been around as long as migrant workers have been around. And that is for one reason and one reason only: the lack of laws, or the failed enforcement of laws to protect migrant workers from abuse, exploitation, savage mistreatment by private employers. Particularly, this is the case for domestic workers who are within the homes of people with no oversight, no regulation, no control. And the increased publicity and investigative reports revealing the extent of the abuse of migrant workers in Saudi Arabia, who really are the ones who fuel most of the blue collar, but even white collar labor in the country, has attracted so much negative attention that the government, I believe, has in earnest tried to make serious reforms, because they don't need the embarrassment. And ultimately, the abuses are taking place by their own citizens. And so they've tried to impose regulations and controls. But ultimately, that has never been fully enforced, because there's a cost to it, because Saudi business owners or employers don't want to pay a true price, the true cost of having workers from around the world come and work in some of the worst jobs in the world, where, and at, salaries that are like $30 a month or $40 a month. And so enforcing the laws means raising the price of labor in the country. I think that's what Saudi Arabia should do, exactly what it should do, because its own citizens are so underemployed and needing jobs, but would never work at the wages that migrant workers agree to work for because of their circumstances. But ultimately, choosing not to enforce the laws is a cost issue. There's also a political issue. We have migrant workers in Saudi Arabia who have lived nearly their entire lives, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, who have absolutely no rights in the country and can be ordered to leave, put on a plane, sent back on a day's notice. And part of this, of course, is that the government does not want to give any actual rights, residency rights, immigration rights to migrant workers. It just wants to use them up and send them home when they are no longer milk producing cows, basically. And it's grotesquely unfair. So there are a lot of reasons why I think Saudi Arabia does have an interest in making serious labor reforms, particularly because of the embarrassment that it brings and the impact on domestic labor, but because it is basically a cost issue. And people are greedy and they don't want to pay more for labor. The abuses continue and the exploitation continues.
Thank you so much. So we have reached the end of the hour, but if there are any additional questions from our live audience, I just wanted to give an opportunity for that. No? Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for attending. We will be sharing a recording of the press conference on our communication channels afterwards, and we invite the press here to ask us any other questions once we end. Thank you so much.